Welcome to China Elite Politics, a podcast about Chinese Communist Party elite politics and operations, US-China relations, and China-related geopolitics. I'm Larry Ong, Senior Analyst at SinoInsider. This is episode number 1. In this episode, I'll be looking at the importance of elite politics in China today, explain what I mean when I talk about factions in the Chinese Communist Party, and use Beijing's handling of Jack Ma and the suspension of N Group's IPO as a recent example of Communist Party factional politics in action. Alright, let's begin. Reading the news or looking at Chinese politics from a layman's point of view, it might seem like Chinese politics is pretty straightforward. The Chinese government controls everything, and the government is controlled by President for Life Xi Jinping. Most people imagine an authoritarian regime in relatively simple terms, like some sort of hive mind where everyone has to follow the orders of the top leader. This gets worse when we're talking about China today. Virtually everyone agrees that General Secretary Xi Jinping is a strongman dictator, the most powerful Chinese leader since Chairman Mao. And as the New York Times has been writing since 2018, Xi is quote-unquote unrivaled and faces no real domestic opposition. However, we know from history that there is no such thing as no political opposition in the Chinese Communist Party. Even Mao Zedong, the most powerful dictator in the PRC's history, had to endlessly fight off challengers to his rule. In fact, factional struggle in the Chinese Communist Party elite was a key reason why Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Around that time, Mao felt threatened by the likes of PRC President Liu Shaoqi and General Peng Dehuai, who criticized Mao over the disastrous Great Leap Forward campaign. Another example is Deng Xiaoping. Deng is described as China's paramount leader, but he too had to fight off several opponents in the form of former party bosses like Hua Guofeng, Hu Yaobang, and Zhao Ziyang, all whom were threats to Deng's rule and his policies. Deng nearly got rid of a fourth party boss in the form of Jiang Zemin because Jiang was not very keen on pursuing Deng's reform and opening up policy in the early 1990s. Jiang, however, got the hint when Deng went on his southern tour in 1992 and he kept his job. Today, everyone knows about Deng's reform and opening up, and its impact on the Chinese economy and society. But history could have turned out very differently if dynamics in the Chinese Communist Party elite politics were not in Deng's favor. For example, if Jiang somehow got his way in the early 1990s, Communist China would become more Maoist and closed up to the outside world. And if Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang had found some way to get the better of Deng Xiaoping, then China would have seen greater political liberalization in the 1980s and 1990s, and might not even be communist today. Given the outsized role of elite politics in communist China, we say at SinoInsider that all issues in China are downstream from Chinese Communist Party elite politics. And at the core of Chinese Communist Party elite politics is factional struggle. Now, what do we mean when we talk about factions and factional politics in communist China? The term factions gets misconstrued a lot, with some people thinking about them as mafia-type enterprises. This is somewhat understandable, as factions have names like Gang of Four or the Shanghai Gang. Technically, factions shouldn't exist at all inside the Chinese Communist Party because the party explicitly outlaws them. However, as anyone who has attended school, worked in an office, or belonged to any organization knows, people tend to stick with like-minded people, and then cliques form. And in workplaces, sometimes these cliques get powerful enough to sway office policy in favor of their interests, particularly if the office managers or the boss are not domineering personalities. So by factions, we are referring to informal groupings of Chinese officials that formed around preserving self-interests and career security. As the late American scholar Lucian Pye explained in his report titled The Dynamics of Factions and Consensus in Chinese Politics. Quote, the prime basis for factions among cadres is the search for career security and the protection of power. The extraordinary force that holds together the networks of officials is the intense attraction of mutual dependency in Chinese culture between superiors and subordinates, each of whom needs the other for his own protection and each of whom is vulnerable to the other, which means that both must be loyal to each other. Thus, the strength of Chinese factions is the personal relationships of individuals who, operating in a hierarchical context, create linkage networks that extend upward in support of particular leaders who are, in turn, looking for followers to ensure their power. What Pye described about factions applies more to office cliques than the vicious gangs we see in American mobster films. And in a way, factions in the modern Chinese Communist Party tend to resemble glorified office cliques. So we rarely see things like, or hardly ever see things like violent gang wars in the streets of Shanghai. That being said, factional struggle is highly consequential for the parties involved. The winners and their followers get to keep their wealth, their power, and their rule over the regime. Meanwhile, the losers and their supporters are purged, and they stand to lose everything. That is why many Chinese commentators describe factional struggle in the Chinese Communist Party elite as, quote, you die, I live, or in Chinese, 你死我活. Factions tend to be named after the political patron sitting right at the top of a chain of interests. For example, the Jiang faction, or the Jiang Pai, is named after the former party boss Jiang Zemin. Factions can also be named after the area or organization from which the bulk of the faction's members hail, such as the so-called Communist Youth League faction, or Tuan Pai, or the Shanghai Gang, or Shanghai Bang. The Shanghai Gang, however, is strictly speaking a faction within a faction, because it consists of officials and elites from Shanghai with connections to Jiang Zemin, but is also part of the larger Jiang faction. In Communist China today, the two most important factions are the Jiang faction and the Xi faction, or Xi camp. Xi Jinping is the figurehead of the Xi camp, or in Chinese, the Xi Zhenying. Its members include Xi's former friends and colleagues like Wang Qishan, Liu He, Li Zhanshu, and Zhao Kezhi. The Xi camp is tiny where factions go because Xi Jinping didn't establish or belong to any faction before taking office in 2012. However, the longer Xi stays in power, the bigger and more influential his faction will become by default. The Jiang faction was the dominant political force in the PRC after Deng Xiaoping passed away in 1997, until the Bo Xilai scandal broke out in 2012. Since 2012, the Jiang faction's influence has declined substantially, with many of its members purged under Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign and through multiple rounds of personnel reshuffles disrupting entrenched factional networks in government. However, Jiang Zemin remains a force behind the scenes today, according to the Wall Street Journal in a February 16, 2021 article. Jiang faction elites have a strong presence in China's financial sector today, and Jiang faction loyalists have not been fully purged despite the multiple rounds of personnel reshuffles and anti-corruption investigations, and there's still many of them in China's permanent bureaucracy, or in American political parlance, the deep state. The core problem in Chinese Communist Party elite politics today is the Xi-Jiang struggle, or Xi-Jiang Dou. Years of power consolidation and anti-corruption purges have given Xi Jinping the advantage in the factional struggle. However, the Jiang faction is far from finished as a political force. It retains a strong presence in the financial sector, has influence and deep networks in Hong Kong, and has some sway over key organs in the Chinese Communist Party's government, including the intelligence apparatus, the political and legal affairs apparatus, and the propaganda apparatus. The Xinjiang factional struggle is bound to escalate in the next 18 months or so, because the Jiang faction will do all they can to stop Xi Jinping from securing a norm-breaking third term in office at the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress in 2022. Meanwhile, Xi will do his best to curb and eradicate the Jiang faction's remaining influence in the government. We see this happening already in Xi's latest campaign to clean up the political and legal affairs apparatus that was launched in 2020. We also see this in his ongoing campaign to root out corruption in the financial sector and bring Chinese tech giants under control. We expect to see some drama and even political black swans in the coming months. As I said earlier, factional struggles in the Chinese Communist Party are you die, I live, especially because massive interests are at stake. So how massive can these interests be? Well, in the case of Ant Group, over $300 billion. At one level, Xi Jinping cancelled Ant's world record-breaking IPO because he was clearly unhappy with the financial risks that Ant's IPO would have saddled the regime. Beijing is also concerned about Ant and Jack Ma acquiring political clout by virtue of it having immense financial clout. Then there is the factional struggle element. According to the Wall Street Journal article that I cited above, quote, well-connected Chinese power players, including some with links to political families that represent a potential challenge to President Xi and his inner circle, end quote, stood to pocket billions of dollars from a successful Ant IPO. These well-connected Chinese power players include members of Jiang Zeming's clan, such as his grandson Alvin Jiang, as well as members of the Shanghai Gang, like the former Politburo Standing Committee member Jia Qingling. The cancellation of Ant's IPO, as well as recent news about Beijing getting Alibaba to unload its media assets, shows that the factional struggle is extremely relevant and consequential for China and the world today. We will explore the unfolding Alibaba, Ant Group, and Jack Ma saga in future episodes, as well as the Xinjiang factional struggle. That's it for now. If you have found this useful, feel free to share it with others.